Lucy's fingers were numb when she walked into that diner, not from the cold, but from what she was about to do. Inside, 200 Hell's Angels sat in silence as she held up her dead father's motorcycle key. "I need to sell this," she whispered. "My mother's dying." The club president's face went pale. He recognized her last name. What happened in the next 60 seconds would change everything, and it had nothing to do with money. This is the story of the day a daughter's desperation met a brotherhood's debt. Before we continue, please subscribe to this channel and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. Enjoy the story. The sound of Lucy's boots against the snow came first. A slow, uneven crunch, steady but strained, each step pressing into frozen ground that refused to soften for her. Snow clung to the hems of her jeans, damp and heavy, and the wind pushed against her back as if urging her to stop. She had already walked farther than her body wanted to admit. 3 miles through a storm like this was not a choice. It was the absence of one. There was nowhere else to go. The truck stop appeared gradually, its neon sign flickering through the snowfall, buzzing faintly like an insect trapped in glass. The light painted the ground in dull reds and whites, reflecting off patches of ice near the entrance. Lucy slowed as she reached it, not from exhaustion alone, but from hesitation. The building stood solid and warm-looking against the dark highway, full of people who belonged there. She did not feel like one of them. Her gloved hand was clenched tight at her side. Inside it was a Harley key, old and worn, the metal scratched from years of use. The leather keychain attached to it was cracked and softened with age, the edges frayed, her father's initials still pressed into it, faint but stubborn. She hadn't realized how hard she was gripping it until the ache spread up her fingers. It was the only thing she hadn't let go of. The storm swallowed most sounds, but not all of them. As she stood before the door, other noises reached her through the glass. Laughter, loud and careless. A country song playing somewhere inside, steady and familiar. Men's voices layered over one another, low and rumbling. Boots scraping against linoleum, chairs shifting. There was the unmistakable clink of ceramic mugs, the rhythm of a place that had been awake all night and expected to stay that way. Lucy didn't move right away. She stood there, snow gathering on her shoulders, listening to a world that felt closed off and unreachable. The thoughts surfaced uninvited, sharp and simple. 3 miles walked through the storm because there had been nowhere else to go. It wasn't self-pity. It was fact. When she finally reached for the door, the handle stole her breath. The cold bit hard enough to sting, sharp and immediate, like touching bare ice with skin already pushed too far. She pulled her hand back instinctively, flexed her fingers, then forced herself to try again. Inside, the sounds continued, unaware of her pause. Voices like distant thunder, boots on linoleum, coffee mugs meeting counters in practiced motions. She stood there for one more moment, chest rising, breath shallow. Desperation has weight. It settles into the body and makes decisions feel inevitable. It strips away the luxury of hesitation. It pushes people toward doors they would never touch under different circumstances. It teaches them how to ask strangers for things they never imagined needing. Lucy drew in a single breath, steadying herself. Then she turned the handle and pushed the door open. Before what happens next can be understood, one thing has to be clear. Desperation doesn't announce itself loudly. It arrives quietly, disguised as resolve. And if anyone listening has ever known that feeling, truly known it, they already understand. Comment, "I understand," if you've been there. The door closed behind Lucy with a muted thud, sealing out the wind and snow in an instant. Warm air rushed over her skin, heavy with the smell of coffee, grease, and damp leather. For a brief second, the world seemed to hold its breath. The music faltered. A laugh cut off halfway through. The low hum of conversation collapsed into silence, so complete it felt physical, pressing against her ears. She stood just inside the entrance, shoulders tight, boots leaving shallow wet prints on the floor. Heat rose from her clothes in faint wisps, the cold clinging to her like something reluctant to let go. The diner was larger than it had seemed from outside, deeper, filled wall to wall with men who looked as though they had been there for years, maybe decades. Leather vests dominated the room, layered over denim and flannel, each one marked with patches in different colors and shapes. Names, symbols, history stitched into fabric. None of them belonged to her. Lucy's eyes moved slowly, carefully, taking it in without appearing to stare. Every booth was full, every counter seat occupied. Coffee cups hovered midair, hands frozen halfway to mouths. She could feel the attention settle on her all at once, the weight of it undeniable. It wasn't just that people were looking at her. It was that they were measuring her, assessing what she was and why she was here. Some faces were curious, others unreadable, a few openly suspicious. The silence stretched, long enough to become uncomfortable, long enough for doubt to creep in. She swallowed and shifted her grip on the Harley key still hidden in her hand. Near the center of the room sat a man who didn't look up right away. He was older than most of the others, his beard gray and thick, his posture solid and unmoving. His hands were wrapped around a coffee mug as if it were part of him, knuckles broad, fingers thick and scarred, like oak roots gripping stone. When he finally raised his head, he didn't rush. His eyes lifted slowly, deliberately, and when they settled on Lucy, they stayed there. Fear tightened in her chest. This was the moment she could still turn back, still apologize, still disappear into the storm outside. Her voice felt small just thinking about it. But fear didn't move her feet. Something else did. Something steadier. Lucy stepped forward. The sound of her boots against the floor echoed louder than it should have. Every eye tracked her as she stopped a few feet inside the room. Her throat tightened, and when she spoke, the words came out rougher than she intended, her voice catching but not breaking. "I need to sell a motorcycle." The sentence landed heavily, cutting through the silence like a dropped plate. No one laughed. No one spoke. The reaction she had braced for, dismissal, ridicule, indifference, never came. Instead, chairs creaked. A few men shifted. The air in the room changed, subtle but unmistakable. Then the biggest man in the diner stood up. He pushed his chair back slowly and rose to his full height, towering over the others. The sound of his boots against the floor was measured, unhurried, as he walked toward her. Lucy stayed where she was, heart pounding, hands clenched at her sides. He stopped in front of her and looked down, his expression unreadable. "What's your last name, girl? Remember that question. Because in 7 minutes, it will be clear why it changed everything." Lucy didn't answer right away. The question hung between them, heavier than anything she had said since walking through the door. Around them, the diner remained unnaturally still, as if every sound had been pressed flat. She could feel the attention sharpen, curiosity giving way to something closer to concern. She lifted her chin slightly and spoke her father's name. James Michael Carver. The effect was immediate. The club president didn't blink. For a fraction of a second, his face emptied of expression entirely, as if the words had struck something too deep to process at once. Then his jaw tightened. His grip loosened. The hand that had been steady moments earlier faltered against the table behind him. He sat back down slowly. Not heavily, not dramatically, just carefully, like a man who suddenly felt the weight of years settle into his bones. A murmur rippled through the room, low and restrained, the kind of sound that comes from shared recognition rather than surprise. Heads turned. A few men looked away, eyes dropping to their mugs. Others stared at Lucy with new intensity, searching her face for something familiar. For a brief moment, the present receded. There was a memory, distant but clear. A leather vest hanging in the back of a closet, pushed aside to make room for coats that never smelled like oil or road dust. A photograph tucked into a drawer, a younger man straddling a Harley, hair darker than, smile wide and unguarded, the world still open in front of him. Her father had looked invincible in that picture, like someone who belonged to something larger than himself. The president looked up again, his eyes softer now, clouded with something that hadn't been there before. When he spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of authority, and edged with something close to grief. Jimmy Carver's daughter. It wasn't a question. Lucy stood frozen, unsure how to respond. Confusion flickered across her face as the meaning of the room shifted around her. The tension that had felt sharp moments ago was changing shape, easing in some places, deepening in others. She hadn't expected recognition. She hadn't expected this. Her father had left the club 15 years earlier. He had traded his vest for a wedding ring, walked away from the road, and built a different kind of life. But the men in that diner hadn't forgotten him. Standing there, Lucy began to understand something she had never been told out loud. Brotherhood, to them, wasn't erased by time or distance. It didn't end when someone walked away. They never stopped being his brothers. The president studied her for a long moment, his gaze steady and searching. Then his eyes dropped to her hand, to the key. The worn Harley key she had carried through the storm, the one still clenched tight in her palm like a final option. His expression shifted again, resolve settling in where shock had been. Put that key away. The words hit harder than anything else that night. Lucy's knees weakened, just slightly, enough for her to feel it. The room remained silent, waiting. If you believe family doesn't end with blood, if you believe brotherhood means something real, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happens next proves it. Lucy found herself sitting in a booth she hadn't chosen. At some point, someone had guided her there, gentle but firm, as if the decision had already been made. A mug of coffee appeared in front of her, steam curling upward, the heat seeping into her hands as she wrapped her fingers around it. They were shaking. She tried to steady them, but the tremor stayed. The men around her listened without interrupting. Faces leaned in. Elbows rested on tabletops. The room had shifted again, settling into a focused quiet that felt different from before. This wasn't suspicion. It was attention. Lucy began with her mother. She explained the diagnosis carefully, the words practiced from repetition rather than comfort. Congestive heart failure. A condition that didn't improve, only stalled, only managed. The medication alone costs $600 a month. Every month. Insurance had denied coverage after the last review, citing technicalities that made sense on paper and nowhere else. Appeals had been filed. Calls had been made. Nothing changed. Her voice tightened when she described the pharmacy. The way the pharmacist's expression hardened, polite but unmoving. No payment, no pills. Policy. As if policy could slow a failing heart. As if rules were stronger than reality. She moved on before anyone could speak, afraid that if she paused, she might not be able to continue. The eviction notice had arrived 2 weeks earlier, slipped into the doorframe like an afterthought. 14 days to vacate. No extensions. No exceptions. The trailer had never been much, but it was shelter. Without it, there was nowhere to put her mother, nowhere to plug in the oxygen machine that hummed through the nights. When she mentioned her father's Harley, her hands tightened around the mug. It was the last thing of value they owned. The last thing that still felt untouchable. She estimated its worth as best she could. Maybe $8,000 on a good day. Less if the buyer pushed. Her plan was simple because it had to be. Sell it for whatever she could get. Buy 3 months of medication. Buy time. Figure out the rest later. She didn't talk about everything. She didn't mention the roof that leaked whenever it rained, the way buckets had become permanent fixtures in the living room. She didn't bring up the furnace that coughed more than it heated, or the cold nights spent layered in coats. She said nothing about skipping meals, about stretching cans of soup across days, about hunger becoming background noise. She just talked about her mother. That was enough. No one interrupted her. No one looked away. When she finished, the silence felt heavier than before, not empty, but full. A younger man a few booths down shifted in his seat. He asked where the motorcycle was. Lucy answered without hesitation. It was at home, she said, in the lean-to shed behind their trailer. Covered, but not locked. He nodded once, as if committing the information to memory. Then he pulled a small notebook from his vest pocket and wrote something down. Lucy noticed it, but she didn't question it. At the time, it didn't seem important. The president rose from his seat without ceremony. The movement alone was enough to draw every eye in the room. He placed both hands on the edge of the table in front of him, fingers spread wide, grounding himself there. The diner was silent again, but this time it wasn't tense. It was attentive. He didn't raise his voice. Jimmy Carver took care of us for 10 years, he said, his words steady and unembellished. Now we take care of his family. That was all. There was no discussion, no questions, no call for opinions. It wasn't a vote in any real sense. It was a declaration, spoken with the authority of someone who didn't need agreement to lead. The decision settled over the room like something long overdue. One man stood up, then another. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as men rose from booths and counter stools. Leather creaked. Hands reached into pockets and wallets without hesitation. Lucy watched from her seat, unsure if she was supposed to speak, unsure if she was even breathing. The first bill hit the table near the president's hands. Then another, and another. 50s, hundreds. Bills folded tight from long carrying. Bills smoothed and crisp, pulled from organized stacks. Some were laid down carefully. Others were dropped without looking, as if the exact amount didn't matter. The pile grew quickly, spreading across the tabletop in uneven layers of green and worn paper. Lucy felt rooted in place. Her chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with something harder to hold. Shock came first, sharp and disorienting. Gratitude followed close behind, heavy enough to bring tears to her eyes before she could stop them. She pressed her lips together and stared at the table, afraid that if she looked at their faces, she would lose control entirely. The sound stayed with her. She would remember it long after that night. The dull thump of money meeting wood. Thump. 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 Not loud. Not showy. Steady. Rhythmic. Like a heartbeat. Like the heartbeat her mother was fighting to keep. Someone counted quietly near the end, murmuring numbers under their breath. When they finished, they looked up at the president and nodded. $6,200. The number didn't feel real. It hovered somewhere between impossible and insufficient, between miracle and math. Lucy's hands trembled again, this time not from cold or fear. She pushed her coffee cup aside and wiped at her eyes, embarrassed by the tears she couldn't hold back. She thought that was it. She thought this was the moment she would stand, thank them, gather the money with shaking hands, and leave before the emotion overwhelmed her. She thought she had been given a gift, an unexpected, life-saving one, and that the night would end there. The president looked at the pile of cash, then at Lucy. "We're not done yet," he said. He turned his gaze to the room. "Everyone mount up." Lucy froze. She didn't understand what he meant. The night didn't slow down after the president spoke. It accelerated. Engines came alive one after another, then together, until the sound became something larger than noise. It rolled outward, deep and heavy, vibrating through the ground and into the chest. 200 motorcycles starting in unison didn't roar so much as announce themselves. It sounded like rolling thunder tearing its way through the storm. Snow kicked up and scattered as headlights cut long white paths through the dark. Lucy wasn't on a bike. She sat in the passenger seat of the president's truck, hands braced against her knees, watching the pack form ahead of them. Red taillights stretched into the distance, weaving and tightening into a single moving body. She had never seen anything like it. The disbelief came first, sharp and disorienting. Then awe followed, quiet and overwhelming. The convoy moved as one. They didn't stop to talk. They didn't explain. The road opened, and they took it. When they arrived at the hospital, the engines cut out almost at once, the sudden quiet ringing in the air. Doors opened. Boots hit pavement. Leather shifted and settled. Lucy followed as the group moved inside together, a solid wall of vests and denim and purpose filling the entrance and flowing into the emergency waiting room. Conversations died mid-sentence. A nurse looked up from the desk and froze. Another leaned closer and whispered something that barely carried across the room, eyes wide with uncertainty. It was impossible to tell, at first glance, whether this was a threat or a miracle, whether the hospital was about to be robbed or rescued. The president stepped forward calmly, carrying a single envelope. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. An administrator appeared, visibly shaken, hands clasped together as if trying to remember procedure. The president placed the envelope on the counter and slid it forward. "This covers Lucy Carver's mother," he said. "All of it." The administrator opened the envelope, glanced inside, then looked up again, clearly struggling to reconcile the number with the moment. $18,000. The club's emergency fund. Enough to erase balances, silence collection calls, and remove conditions. Enough to change what the next weeks would look like. The administrator nodded quickly, words stumbling over each other as assurances followed. Paperwork would be handled. Treatment would continue uninterrupted. There would be no delays. Lucy stood slightly behind the president, barely aware of where to put her hands, her thoughts lagging behind reality. What had felt impossible hours earlier was being dismantled in front of her, not with speeches or sympathy, but with action. The nurse at the desk glanced again at the assembled group, then back at her coworker, still unsure what she was witnessing. In a way, the answer was both. The debt was being robbed of its power. A life was being rescued. Lucy felt it then, not just gratitude, but something deeper. A recognition that she had stepped into something she didn't understand yet, something bound by loyalty rather than obligation. Strangers had shown up, not because they were asked, but because they remembered. If this moment stirs anything at all, shock, hope, disbelief. Drop a comment and say what would happen if help arrived like this. Because the story isn't over. The second destination wasn't announced. Lucy only realized where they were headed when the convoy slowed and turned onto a narrow street lined with tired storefronts and dim windows. The motorcycles pulled in front of a small finance office, the kind of place that blended into towns like this by design. Cheap carpet, fluorescent lights, promises printed in small fonts. Inside, the manager saw them coming. Through the front window, he caught sight of the first bike, then the second, then the line that seemed to stretch endlessly behind them. Panic moved faster than thought. He stood up so quickly his chair tipped backward, scrambling toward the door. The lock turned halfway before hands started knocking. Not hard, not violent, just firm. Certain. The president opened the door himself and stepped inside as if he had an appointment. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't hurry. He crossed the room calmly, boots steady against the thin carpet, and stopped in front of the desk. The manager stood frozen, keys still in his hand, face drained of color. The hum of the fluorescent lights suddenly felt too loud. The president asked for the contract. Hands shaking, the manager slid it across the desk. Pages were flipped slowly, deliberately. Numbers were read without comment. 28% interest. A balloon payment designed to fail. Fees stacked on fees. Terms written to trap rather than serve. The kind of agreement that fed on desperation and called it business. The president looked up. "This debt is forgiven," he said. "Today." The manager swallowed hard. His mouth opened, words rushing forward out of reflex. He said he couldn't just do that. He said there were policies, procedures, approvals. He said it wasn't how things worked. The president leaned forward slightly, just enough to be unmistakable. "You can," he said. "And you will." There was no threat in his tone, no raised voice, just certainty. Legally, it existed in a gray space, barely defensible, but effectiveness doesn't always wait for permission. The manager's eyes flicked toward the window again, toward the silhouettes outside, unmoving and patient. Loyalty has weight, too. It fills rooms. It presses decisions forward. Paperwork was adjusted. Numbers were struck through. Signatures appeared where they hadn't existed minutes earlier. When it was done, the president took the document, folded it once, and tucked it into his jacket as if it were nothing more than a receipt. Outside, engines remained silent, waiting. This was what vindication sounded like when it didn't need applause. Desperation makes people walk into rooms they'd never enter. Loyalty does the same. These men walked into that office like they owned it, not because of money or power, but because in that moment, they did. Lucy stood just behind them, watching something inside her life reset itself. A future that had felt closed off began to open, quietly, without ceremony. Justice didn't arrive as a speech. It arrived as a corrected line on a contract and a door unlocked. She thought the night was finally winding down when they pulled away. She was wrong. There was one more stop. She didn't know it until the convoy slowed again and turned down a familiar road, headlights washing over a place she knew too well. Her house. The convoy slowed as it turned onto the narrow road leading to Lucy's trailer. Headlights washed over familiar ground, illuminating peeling paint, packed dirt, and the small lean-to shed standing just off to the side. The engines cut one by one until the night settled into a heavy, respectful quiet. No one spoke. The president stepped out of his truck and walked toward the shed without asking permission, his pace unhurried, certain. Lucy followed a few steps behind, her confusion growing with every stride. This wasn't part of her plan. This wasn't something she had asked for. The shed door creaked softly as he reached it, the metal protesting years of weather and neglect. He stopped in front of it and rested his hand on the edge of the tarp inside, pausing for a moment as if acknowledging what waited beneath. Then, slowly, he pulled it back. The Harley emerged inch by inch. Dust clung to the tank and handlebars, untouched for nearly a year. The tires were dull but full. The chrome was muted, not ruined. It hadn't been abandoned. It had been waiting. Time had settled on it gently, like a promise held in reserve. The president leaned closer and ran his hand along the tank, his fingers tracing familiar lines. His gaze caught on a sticker near the back, old and half-peeled, the adhesive long past its prime. A mark from another life. Another chapter. He stared at it longer than the rest, jaw tightening just slightly. Then he turned to Lucy. "We're not buying this bike," he said. The words didn't land right away. Lucy frowned, trying to understand. Everything in her life for weeks had narrowed to a single goal: sell the motorcycle, trade memory for survival. His statement knocked the air out of that logic. "We're taking it," he continued. Lucy shook her head, confusion flooding her face. She started to speak, then stopped. He held up a hand. Not to silence her, but to steady the moment. "This bike doesn't belong on a sales lot," he said. "It belongs with his brothers. We're going to restore it, and we're going to remember him." The meaning unfolded slowly, like something too big to absorb all at once. The fear that had driven her here, the sacrifice she had prepared herself to make, suddenly had nowhere to stand. Her chest tightened, then broke open. She started crying, not because she was losing the bike, but because she realized she had never needed to sell it. Her father had already paid for everything they needed. He paid with years of loyalty, with rides through rain and sun, with showing up, with brotherhood that didn't expire when life changed. And now, his brothers were here to settle the debt. 3 men moved quietly forward and began loading the Harley onto a trailer. No rush, no spectacle. Lucy watched as the bike was secured, the tarp folded carefully beside it. She stood still as it rolled away, taillights fading into the dark. She thought that was goodbye, but 6 months later, she got a call. Lucy arrived at the clubhouse without quite understanding what she was about to see. The building itself was unassuming from the outside, solid and practical, built for function rather than display. Inside, the air was cool and still, the polished concrete floor reflecting the harsh white glow of fluorescent lights overhead. The space felt quiet in a way that demanded respect, as if voices naturally lowered once crossing the threshold. She took a few steps in and stopped. At the center of the room, elevated slightly on a simple platform, stood the Harley. It took a moment for her to recognize it, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it had been transformed. The chrome gleamed under the lights, flawless and bright. Every line was clean, every detail restored with care that went far beyond mechanical obligation. The tank had been repainted in her father's original colors, matched perfectly, the shade unmistakable to anyone who had known him. It didn't look like a museum piece. It looked alive. Lucy felt her breath catch. Beneath the motorcycle, mounted to the platform, was a small plaque. The lettering was simple, etched deeply enough to last. James Michael Carver. Brother, father, rider. Forever on the road. She read it twice before the words settled into meaning. Around her, the room remained still. No one rushed her. No one spoke. The president stepped forward and held out his hand. Resting in his palm was the familiar Harley key, the same worn metal, the same cracked leather keychain with her father's initials pressed into it. Lucy stared at it, her vision blurring. "This stays here," he said quietly. "But it's still yours. You can visit any time." She took the key with both hands, as if it were something fragile. Her fingers closed around it, and for the first time since the night of the storm, the weight felt different. Not heavy, grounding. Beside her stood her mother. She looked stronger than she had months earlier. Healthier. Her posture was steadier, her breathing easier. Tears streamed freely down her face as she stared at the motorcycle, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other gripping Lucy's arm as if afraid she might disappear. This wasn't just remembrance. It was proof. Proof that what they had survived meant something. Grief lingered in the room, but it had changed shape. It no longer pressed downward. It lifted, reshaped into legacy. Her father wasn't frozen in loss here. He was honored, remembered as he had lived, not as he had left. Lucy stood there, surrounded by people who had once been strangers, and understood something she hadn't before. Her father had given up his freedom for her, stepping away from the road to build a different life. And his brothers had given her freedom back when she needed it most. That was what family did. The president let the silence hold for a moment longer before speaking again. "There's one more thing you need to know," he said. Something Lucy wouldn't learn until later. The president sat across from Lucy at a small table near the back of the clubhouse, away from the others. An old photo album lay open between them, its spine cracked, pages yellowed with age. The room was quieter here, insulated from the larger space, as if the building itself understood the need for privacy. He turned a page slowly. There was her father, younger than Lucy had ever known him, arms slung around another man's shoulder, both of them grinning into the camera. Another page showed a group shot, bikes lined up behind them, dust on their boots, sun in their eyes. These weren't staged photos. They were moments caught without ceremony, without the knowledge that they would one day matter this much. The president rested his hand on the album and finally spoke. "Your dad didn't leave the club because he was angry," he said. "He left because he fell in love." Lucy looked up, surprised. He explained that when Lucy's parents decided to build a life together, Jimmy Carver knew something would have to give. The road demanded time. So did family. He chose the one that needed him more. There was no falling out, no broken loyalties, just a quiet decision made with the same seriousness he brought to everything else. But that wasn't the whole truth. The president turned another page. While Jimmy stepped away from riding, he never stopped working. 2 jobs, sometimes 3, for 3 straight years. He told the club he was saving for his family. That wasn't a lie, but it wasn't complete either. He was raising money to help the club buy their own place. A permanent home. Somewhere they wouldn't be at the mercy of landlords or borrowed spaces. When Jimmy passed, the money was already there. The club used it to secure the building Lucy was sitting in now. The president closed the album gently and met her eyes. "Your father built this place," he said. "So it's as much yours as it is ours." The words landed softly but carried weight. Pride came first, swelling unexpectedly in Lucy's chest. Not pride in sacrifice alone, but in intention. Her father hadn't walked away. He had stayed connected in a quieter way, supporting something he believed in without needing recognition. Belonging followed. For years, Lucy had believed her father had left that life behind completely, that he had chosen something smaller, something safer. Sitting there now, she understood how wrong that assumption had been. He hadn't abandoned Brotherhood. He had expanded it. Later, when Lucy tried to put words to what she felt, they came out simply. She thought her father had left them behind. But he never did. He just loved differently. And they loved him back the only way they knew how, by protecting what he protected. Her. The album stayed open on the table long after the conversation ended, its pages quietly doing what they had always done. Remembering. Time has a way of softening edges without erasing meaning. Lucy still visits the clubhouse. Not as a guest, not as an outsider, but as someone who belongs. She walks the same polished floor, pauses in front of the memorial platform, and rests her hand near the Harley the way her father once did, lightly, respectfully. The bike is always immaculate. Club members polish it weekly, not because anyone told them to, but because no one needs to be told. Her mother is doing well now. Stable. Stronger. The medication that once felt impossible is covered by a fund the club quietly maintains for families who need it. There are no speeches about it, no recognition. It simply exists, doing what it was built to do, keeping people alive long enough to breathe again. The trailer is paid off completely. No notices on the door. No numbers hanging over their heads. Just a home that no longer feels temporary. A place where Lucy's mother can sit comfortably, laugh more easily, and plan further than a week ahead. Lucy works during the day and studies at night. She's building something of her own, slowly and deliberately, the way lasting things are built. Once a month, she visits the clubhouse. Sometimes she stays for hours. Sometimes only a few minutes. No one keeps track. No one questions it. She's always welcome. The Harley never leaves. It stays on its platform, chrome bright, tank flawless, a presence rather than an object. It isn't frozen in the past. It's integrated into the present. Every year, on her father's birthday, the club rides in his honor. Engines start together. The road opens. His name is spoken without ceremony, because it doesn't need one. The ride says enough. Peace settles in quietly, not as relief alone, but as confidence. Hope doesn't arrive loudly either. It grows from knowing that when everything fell apart, someone showed up and stayed. If you believe family isn't just blood, if you believe brotherhood, sisterhood, and loyalty still mean something real in this world, then subscribe. Because these are the stories worth telling. Stories about people who don't look away when it matters. And if you believe people deserve a second chance when they're desperate, not judgment, not shame, but help, comment Family Rides Together. Let this be a place where that belief lives. Because the truth is simple and uncomfortable. Everyone is one bad day away from needing someone to show up. The only question is whether someone will. The room grows quiet again, the way it did that first night. But this silence is different. It isn't heavy. It lingers with intention. The Harley stands alone now, cared for, complete, no longer waiting. Once, just once, the engine turns over. A single, controlled rev fills the space, deep and familiar, then settles back into stillness. The sound doesn't demand attention. It leaves a mark instead. Lucy's voice carries softly, steady and certain, shaped by everything that came before. She says that sometimes the most dangerous-looking men are the ones who protect the hardest. That sometimes family isn't blood. And that sometimes mercy rides on two wheels. There is no explanation after that. None is needed. The story doesn't end with noise or spectacle. It ends with understanding. With the knowledge that strength doesn't always announce itself, and loyalty doesn't always wear a uniform people recognize. Sometimes it wears leather. Sometimes it shows up uninvited. Sometimes it stays. The engine starts again, this time farther away, moving forward instead of echoing back. The sound fades gradually, not into nothing, but into distance, like a road continuing long after it disappears from view. The memory remains. In memory of all the fathers who ride.